Here again, and today I want to talk to you about the concept of limiting factors. Okay, so let's take a look at this greenhouse. As you all know, a greenhouse is where you can grow plants in a controlled environment, and so within this greenhouse you can control a few things. Firstly, you can control the temperature, right? You can control the amount of carbon dioxide, and you can also control the amount of light that the plants will receive. So when we talk about the word limiting factors, you can oftentimes think of it as something similar to baking a cake, right? Let's say you want to talk about baking a cake, and let's say, just for a simple example, you have three ingredients, right? Sugar, flour, and butter. Okay, these three ingredients: sugar, flour, and butter. Now, should you be lacking on any of these one ingredients, you will not be able to make a cake. For example, you have a lot of flour, you have a lot of butter, but you have zero or very little bit of sugar, then you have no cake. Right? Same story, right? You can repeat it in other ways. Basically, it means that that substance is limiting the cake, right? It's a factor that is limiting the cake that you can produce. But if you have more of that substance, when you have more of the sugar, then you can start to make more and more cake. So in this same way, right, when we talk about limiting factors in photosynthesis, right, we can see that in this figure, right, 12 point whatever, right, we can see that as the light intensity increases, the rate of photosynthesis increases from 0 to 8. Here, light intensity is the limiting factor. All right, so from 0 at this point over here, when there's very, very low light intensity, as you increase the light intensity, we will say that from this point to A, light intensity is a limiting factor. Why? Because this is the factor that directly affects the rate of chemical reaction. And so the rate of reaction can only be increased if the value of this limiting factor is increased. In this case, light intensity. Now, beyond point A, light is no longer the limiting factor since the rate of photosynthesis remains constant even though light density increases. So then the other two factors, for example, temperature or carbon dioxide, could potentially become the limiting factor. Why I say could potentially, it does depend on whether or not you can increase that factor further, right? For example, if you're talking about temperature, there's a limit. I can't keep on increasing the temperature. So at this point, we say that light is no longer the limiting factor because the rate of photosynthesis remains constant even when light intensity increases. Okay, let's take a look at two more examples. Okay, let's say that the temperature remains constant and the carbon dioxide concentration of the environment is raised up to 0.13, right, from 0.03. And we see that the rate of photosynthesis greatly increases as shown. So this now indicates that carbon dioxide is the limiting factor between point A and point B. So why I say that is because from you see that from here to here on the red line, you can increase the light, but eventually it becomes constant, right? So this 0.03, now this 0.03 is the limiting factor between points A and point B, because when you increase it to 0.13, the rate of photosynthesis jumps up by a lot. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. Okay, then you might be asking, but how about at here, the blue line over here at this point? Is it carbon dioxide is the limiting factor, or is it light is the limiting factor? The answer, of course, is both lah. At this point, light is limiting, right? Because you got too little light. But at a certain point over here about A, right, then you can say that the light is no longer the limiting factor, but carbon dioxide is now the only limiting factor. Okay, so we know that under natural condition, right, in our atmosphere, our carbon dioxide concentration is only about 0.03. So you can actually raise it up to a higher amount, a higher concentration. Let's look at one more example here. So in this example, we increase the temperature from 20 degrees Celsius to 30 degrees Celsius. And we keep the carbon dioxide concentration constant at 0.13%. And we see that this causes a large increase in the rate of photosynthesis as shown in the graph. So what we see is that between point E to point F, the temperature of the surrounding is the limiting factor. Okay, so let's run through this all again. So from the point, let's say this point 0 from point 0 to point E, light intensity is the limiting factor because as you increase light intensity, the rate of photosynthesis increases. From between E and F, light is no longer the limiting factor. Now temperature is the limiting factor. As you increase the temperature from 20 degrees Celsius to 30 degrees Celsius, the rate of photosynthesis increases drastically between graph 2 and graph 3. Okay, and then for carbon dioxide, this is what we call as a constant factor, right? A constant, you do not really need to change it in this case, although you already have put in as possibly as much carbon dioxide as you potentially need, so you can say that carbon dioxide will not be a limiting factor in this case. Okay, so please take some time to digest that concept, right? It can be a bit tricky, but once you wrap your head around it, it's actually quite a simple concept of limiting factor. Let's now talk about glucose, right? What happens to the glucose that is formed during photosynthesis? So the glucose that is formed during photosynthesis can either be used immediately, right? Or it can be stored in the plant. Let's look at all the ways that glucose can be used. Number one, right? The first way is that when glucose is made during photosynthesis, is immediately used for cellular respiration to provide energy for cellular activities. Okay, so when we talk about cellular respiration, remember this happens in the mitochondria. This usually involves aerobic respiration. All right, I'm actually not too sure whether plants can do anaerobic respiration. Let's just assume that they cannot. Okay, now glucose can also be used to form the cellulose cell wall. Remember that the cell wall, right, this rigid structure that provides the plant with that fixed shape and protects the plant from, gives it it protects the plant basically from damage. Right, this structure cellulose is basically repeated units of glucose, thousands and thousands of glucose molecules that are arranged in a pretty much straight line, like a bit like laying down bricks, and then they form the cellulose cell wall. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, this second thing, right, in daylight, when the rate of photosynthesis is great, that glucose is forming faster than it can be removed, this excess, okay, and keyword is excess, don't forget to write the excess word. Excess glucose can be converted into starch. And this is also one of the reasons why we can do the starch test on the leaf to prove that photosynthesis occurs. But in the darkness, right, when the plant is not photosynthesizing, the photosynthesis will stop and the starch can be converted back into glucose using some enzymes. Okay, specifically we got our amylase, maltase enzymes. Then glucose can be converted also into sucrose. Okay, do you remember these two sugars from our chapter on, I think it's nutrients? Okay, you recall that they are quite similar in their form. Glucose is 1 unit and sucrose is actually a 2 unit of one glucose and one fructose molecule. Okay, so it's like a disaccharide and then glucose is a monosaccharide. Also remember that sucrose, we did our food test, right? Sucrose is a non-reducing sugar. It doesn't work with the Benedict test. Okay, but this sucrose, anyway, as I was saying, glucose converted to sucrose, and this sucrose is one of the reasons why actually when you eat like fruits or something, right, it actually tastes quite sweet. This is one of the reasons why sucrose, it tastes sweet. So sucrose can be used for a few different things. Firstly, it can be transported to other parts of the plants, for example, the storage organ, and found in the seeds, right? So that's one of the reasons when you eat certain fruits with the seeds around it, it tastes sweet, right? It can be found in the stem tubers or the root tubers, and sucrose is transported through the phloem. Okay, I hope that you remember the structure of the phloem. Okay, next, sucrose can be converted into other forms of storage compounds at the storage organ depending on the plant. For example, sucrose can be converted into starch also in like maybe tapioca, potato, etc. And sucrose can also be converted back into glucose for respiration. And sucrose is a component in nectar in flowers which attracts insect for pollination, right? So the plant actually releases some of this nectar, smells sweet, right? It releases the scent, and then the pollinators will come to the plant and help to do sexual reproduction for the plant. Next, fourth point, glucose can be converted into amino acids in the leaf. So many people oftentimes think that plants, they are made purely from carbohydrates, that there's no protein, there's no fats in plants. That's not true. Plants also can form proteins. Okay, so the amino acids can be used to form proteins, and these proteins are used to make new protoplasm in the leaves. Remember that protoplasm, right, it consists mainly of proteins and also a little bit of fats and a little bit of carbohydrates also. Okay, now the excess amino acids can be transported to other parts of the plants, right? For synthesis of new protoplasm, same thing, you want to make new cells, right? And also, it can be stored as proteins. This is one of the reasons why when you eat certain beans, like for example, lentil bean, right, soya bean, these are known as high protein beans, right? That is good for, build muscle, build bodybuilder, that kind of stuff. Okay, last but not least, the fifth thing is that glucose can be used to form fats, all right? And so the fats can be used for storage. The fats can be broken back down into glucose during cellular respiration, and it can also be used to form new protoplasm, right? Used to make the cell membrane. So the question is, why is photosynthesis so important? Okay, now actually, photosynthesis has been occurring for millions of years already, right? Since the earth was formed, then there was some bacteria on the earth, and over time, right, at first there was no life, right? But what actually made life possible is the presence of oxygen. Okay, so that's because of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the process which makes chemical energy available to animals and other organisms. We say that the sun or sunlight is the ultimate source of energy for all living organisms. During photosynthesis, the chlorophyll pigment will absorb energy from light and transfer it to the chemical stores of energy in carbohydrate molecules, for example, glucose. Fats, protein, and other organic compounds can be formed from these carbohydrates. And all these substances eventually become the food of other organisms. So all organisms thus obtain chemical energy directly, right, like plants directly or indirectly from plants. That means the herbivores, and then there's subsequent the carnivores, because plants are the producer in the food chain. Okay, so remember the terms. I talk about producer, we have talked about the primary consumer, our herbivores over here, right, our secondary consumer, right, smaller carnivores that things like wolves, etc. And then our tertiary consumers, right, things like our lion, who can, the top of the food chain. Okay, second point, photosynthesis would remove carbon dioxide and provide oxygen. So we can't have too much carbon dioxide in the air, firstly, because carbon dioxide can cause climate change, right? It's a greenhouse gas, it will cause the earth to become hotter. At the same time, we can't have too little carbon dioxide in the air because plants need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. So when carbon dioxide is removed from the air and oxygen is being produced, the oxygen can then be used by living organisms during aerobic respiration to release energy for cell activities. And this process of photosynthesis will then maintain that constant level of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, so there's that balance between the two gases. Okay, third, energy stored in fossil fuels come from photosynthesis. And all the energy in fossil fuels like coal, right? Coal is basically what you use when you cook your barbecue, right? Oil, gas, all of these fossil fuels, which are maybe plants or dinosaurs long ago that have been fossilized over the years, pressurized by the pressure and the heat of the earth, they turn into all these things like coal, oil, and gas. So actually, all of this energy, it actually indirectly or directly, it came from the sun, right? Because the energy was captured during photosynthesis. And whenever we burn fossil fuels, we release the energy, we use the energy for things like cooking, generating of electricity, and etc. Okay, so these are three big reasons why photosynthesis is crucial, right? Very important for the survival of all species on Earth. Okay, I think this experiment, I will just let you read it out yourself. Okay, so but just to sum up this experiment really quickly, let's talk about some of the points over here. So we talk about the idea of limiting factors just now, right? So we said, why does increasing light density above 80 arbitrary units not increase the rate of photosynthesis? What do you think the answer will be? Right, very simple to say is that above 80 arbitrary units, light intensity is no longer a limiting factor Therefore, it does not increase the rate of photosynthesis. Then what are the two other ways? You can then talk about the other two factors, things like increasing the temperature, increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide. Okay, we'll pause here, and hopefully in the last video, we'll be able to finish this movement of substances in plants, right, which is also quite a big chapter. Alright, so I will catch you in school. See you and study hard. Alright, bye-bye.